Hello and welcome to The Appetite. We are clinicians from Opal Food and Body Wisdom, an eating disorder treatment center in Seattle, Washington. I'm your host, Carter Umhow, and I'm joined by the Opal founders,
Dr. Lexi Giblin,
Kara Bozzi,
Julie Church.
Today we're exploring sport and how the qualities that make a good athlete might be the very same temperamental factors that lead to an athlete's loss of joy in their sport. Not to mention maybe a struggle with disordered eating and overexercise. Kara Bozzi will be sharing from her expertise, drawing on her experience both as a collegiate athlete and as the creator of Opal's exercise and sport program. We'll be looking at the athlete through the lens of radically open dialectical behavioral therapy, wondering what we might be able to learn about the particular strengths and struggles of the athlete through understanding of the overcontrolled temperament. We hope this conversation will create space for more freedom, flexibility, and joy in your relationship with exercise, sport, or movement. So to start us off, I would love to hear what makes an athlete great.
All right. I've been waiting for this.
Yes.
Gosh, I'm really excited about today's podcast. For those of you that are sport lovers out there, athletes yourselves, just to talk more about sports and how that intersects with our work at Opal. And this question of what makes an athlete great. I think there are so many things that contribute to an athlete's greatness. And I imagine even in just asking that question, certain athletes come to mind of, old school Michael Jordan back in the day. We got Tiger Woods, right? Athletes that come to mind as just really stellar, incredible athletes. And there's so many reasons, things that are in an athlete's control and things that are not controllable that make an athlete great. And of course, the big one of what's not in control is genetics,
Right.
which is a big one,
Yes.
whether you're blessed with those genes to be great. And then there's, of course, the things that are in control, in our control. I think somebody came up with a list of about 40 qualities of what makes an athlete great, including work ethic, coachability, nutrition, how someone's caring for their body with nutrition, training, again, genetics, the list. There's lots of factors. Can you guys think of any other ones that come to mind?
I would think of discipline right away, maybe because I don't have it in the same way when it comes to sports, but discipline. And that relates to teachability, I would imagine, as well.
Yeah. Access to training, access to coaches.
So I was thinking of
resources.
in that way.
Well, I know today we are talking about the overlap between radically open dialectical behavioral therapy and sport. And I think of lots of over-controlled traits as being quite advantageous for athletes. So things like attention to detail, ability to delay gratification, superior inhibitory control, grit, being more rule-bound versus mood-dependent in your decisions to do workouts, for example. Like, I don't feel like I'm going to train today would be more of a, I just don't feel like it would be more of a mood-driven characteristic for in the under-control temperament. But somebody who's over-control would be like, what does mood have to do with it? Right. This is what I was supposed to do. So I would think over-control would really serve a person quite well, generally in sport.
Yeah. Yeah. So this the temperament aspect of how that intersects with sport performance.
Yeah. And I would think it would serve certain sports better to have an over-controlled temperament. So more sports where where spontaneity isn't required, like running or swimming, whereas with basketball or where unpredictability is part of the sport, I think that would be more difficult for the over-controlled client or for the over-controlled athlete.
Right. For the individual sports, you would inherently have a little bit more control over your sport performance because you're not relying on a team.
Right.
Yeah. So you can take more things. You can assume more control in an individual.
And the
sport
movement's more
environment.
repetitive. It's the same, almost the same movement versus what you experience in basketball or football.
Yeah.
Where you just don't know what's going to happen next.
Yeah. So then one of the interesting, again, we're going to be exploratory today, I think, as it relates to temperament in sport. But one interesting question would be chicken or the egg. Does an over-controlled person get drawn to particular sports? Or does it go in the opposite direction? Does a sport make someone a little bit more into a particular way of being? I don't know the answer to that.
I was
But
waiting
it's a good
for
question.
the answer. I wanted
It's
it.
actually a question in the eating disorder field. If somebody is it kind of the chicken or the egg? Did somebody with some of the propensity or the characteristics of an eating disorder get drawn into those particular sports? Or did the sport itself and the sport environment elicit eating disorder behaviors?
Backing up a little bit, a lot of our listeners probably wouldn't know that within eating disorder treatment, movement and sport isn't always talked about. So I'd love to hear from you, Kara, what it is that brought you to the kind of the positionality that you might have around how to think about athleticism and how it relates to this.
Well, I think my entry into it was personal because, like I said, even with the chicken or the egg, I developed an eating disorder within the context of my sport through long distance running and doing that in the collegiate environment. And so I really personally could connect those dots between the traits of having a restrictive food disorder and then being an elite athlete and seeing them function to help my sport performance, but then, as we'll talk more later, how it turned into hindering my sport performance. And so because of that experience, I mean, I think it just fueled this passion of mine to want to get into this work and to help both on the prevention side and with athletes that are dealing with this and really addressing a lot of the myths out there about how really what I've learned is the OC temperament can be problematic. Because people in the sport world are still often working with the assumption that those are very essential to being a good athlete and not seeing how it can turn, it can quickly kind of go onto the other side of the fence where it can become problematic. And so those, I would say that's probably the most pleasure I get out of what I do at Opal is having these conversations each week in a group called Rethinking Exercise and Sport of just people get to the point of seeing that it didn't work, but they don't know why, and they don't know how to connect the dots of what's kind of become problematic.
So the way that they maybe went about their life, went about their sport, went about their passion was functioning really well in one way, and then it started translating and got them into some really
Murky
big struggles.
territory.
Right.
And it usually works well at the beginning. I mean, that's often an athlete's story is, especially when they're young and in youth sports, usually things are going really well. Then you start to get to the more competitive levels and it starts to go, okay. And then as more and more of that experience occurs, then we get into some more problematic behaviors. And a lot of it is unknowing. And when you think of even just the kind of broader cultural perspective of no pain, no gain, just do it, more is better, put on your game face. There's a lot of kind of phrases out there and mottos out there that are sort of seen without any question as this what would be communicated in the sport world, but taken to the far extreme, it can become
and I'm thinking about the ways that what it looks like when OC traits are problematic for an athlete. So I'm thinking of, the high pain tolerance becomes tolerating injuries that they shouldn't be tolerating, or the sport becomes more important than the relationships. The person maybe their over-controlled temperament drives them to choose a workout over going to dinner with their friend, or their competitiveness on the team gets in the way of their connection to their teammates, and the sport achieving in the sport becomes more important than the teammate, for example.
And the hard part is that people don't often see that as a problem because they're so wrapped up in the sport performance, they don't care what they're sacrificing until they care. Often, that they're willing to make all those sacrifices. I mean, especially when you get higher up in the athlete world and you go up to even the Olympic levels, the question, is it worth the sacrifice? Is it worth it to have that achievement and the sacrifices involved in that achievement? And I think that's a difficult question.
Yeah. Because I could imagine being on a team, you're also competing against your teammates in some ways or at some levels. And so you want to make sure that you don't get too attached. You need to make sure that you're not too concerned about the relationships or your emotions around what's happening in order to do a little bit better than that person or use that fuel. I remember that as a very not serious athlete, but like using the fuel of being angry at the other team in order to play really well, which could be really helpful. But, if you cared too much, it could be a problem.
Right.
Well, and that brings up helpful envy versus unhelpful envy. And I'm curious how this relates to competition because in RODBT, we talk about unhelpful envy being that envy where you're like you're hoping they do poorly the other and you want to succeed and win and whatever that might mean for the relationship, or you have a, brewing resentment towards a rival that you hold, and that would be potentially damaging to the relationship with that person. Maybe that doesn't matter because all that matters is achieving. But then there's also helpful envy, which I think is what you're probably getting at when you talk about competition from an RO perspective, which is about where you feel inspired by someone and you feel like interested in how they're achieving what they're achieving, and you because you've seen that they've been able to do something that you didn't think was possible. For example, it now opens the door to your own possibility and your own achievement. Right. And that feeling of competition where you appreciate how they're driving you to achieve and take it another step that you didn't even know you could achieve. Yeah,
that's the language we commonly use in our group, is comparing the perfectionism and excellence, because there is that healthy. A lot of times clients will ask, well, is it healthy to be competitive? And what Lexi's just describing is what I would describe as that healthy competitiveness, where you are inspired by somebody else and that fuels your kind of drive or your investment in the sport, but them winning doesn't diminish you as an athlete. And that's the big differentiation. And so in a perfectionist model, which again would be more of an OC trait, is that the result, the kind of the end result of the competition is a marker for whether you're good or bad, essentially. And so if somebody beats you, then you're less than, and that's not a great place to be. Whereas if you're working from a more excellence model, you're just pursuing something that you want to be pursuing and you want to be great at it. And you're not as hard on yourself and down on yourself if you're not the winner.
I always think it's important in competition to think that if you don't have anyone to compete against, you don't have a sport. You can't compete, right? And so if you were so good that there was nobody that would beat you, then you'd also be bored. As an athlete,
it's so fun to have competition.
You have to have competition to be alive.
Yes.
So to be, be lively and like live that.
Yes, so, there's it's not all evil. Competition is so there's so much fun. I mean, that's what I think it can. It drives a lot of energy and excitement. I mean, even just you talking about it, I'm like, yes, I know. And so it can be so great, as so long as if you're not winning or if you're doing poorly, you're not crushing yourself in the midst of it. And, I can relate personally to kind of all of this, where the OC got the best of me, where it really just completely crushed me and my sport performance declined as a result of how living in a more perfectionist model where joy just gets sucked out of the sport. And that's not fun. That's a nice, horrible way to end the day. I remember crying after almost every single race in college, just beating myself up that I just didn't amount to anything because I didn't race well. Whereas now it's like, yeah, I might be bummed if we get crushed on the basketball court, but I mean, nothing. It's not going to suggest anything about who I am as a person. So, and
I had a serious rival growing up.
Yeah,
like one person that I was gunning against, major, and we were on the same team.
Was this basketball?
Swimming.
Yeah.
And we just, it was years and years of going after each other.
And would you describe it in a healthy way, like a fun way?
I don't think it was very healthy.
No.
I mean, I did achieve more because of her. And I think she would say the same. But we weren't, I wouldn't say we kept a close relationship through it. And we were on the same team.
Yeah.
I think we were like gunning for each other at every pass.
I think that's hard to keep a good relationship though, too.
Yeah, right?
Like what kind of relationship are you expecting to have, you know? Like even in the RO conversation of connectedness and like trying to keep that, I'm like, okay, well, what does that actually look like? There was a great, Lexi and I both love 30 for 30s on ESPN, and they're about the tennis players and how they're just, I'm horrible with the names. Help me out. No? Nobody can help me out. Female tennis players that were...
Venus and Serena?
Yeah.
Venus and Serena. Williams?
No, this is horrible. Shouldn't have brought it up. Anyways, but and just it was so amazing to be able to watch how their competitiveness, and then even watching the film about the female golfers that came of age and created the LPGA, the film called The Founders, of all those women and how they were competing against each other, but then how there was different ways that some of them had still that camaraderie and connectedness and community building, like within the sport, and then some of them didn't. Like some of them more were independent, right? Like took their own stance and separated from the tribe, and then like what did that do for the sport? But
were you talking about Battle of the Sexes?
No.
Oh shoot!
What's that?
That's a tennis movie.
Oh shoot! Yeah. No,
but
sorry.
Anyway,
I shouldn't have brought it up. Oh, listeners, you can tell us.
That's okay, but I mean, it does speak to the idea that there's a way to have a really amazing team atmosphere that allows you to really build each other up, or it could be something that's incredibly destructive.
Right.
But I'm having a hard time imagining any time in a sport where it might not be helpful. Where it would be helpful actually to kind of dehumanize your opponent a little bit. That could be helpful sometimes, right? Sounds nasty.
Ooh, Carter has this look on her face like,
I
no,
know.
Don't say it's not so.
Yeah. But like you kind of have to make sure you're thinking about how you're doing. Or like, I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's when you're on the same team, it gets trickier.
Right.
Well, I was thinking back to a client we had that was in a collegiate distance running team, and how she was describing the team culture where it was kind of dog eat dog world, right? Like they were competing against each other. They lost a sense of connection. They were competing over a bunch of things, including who could eat the least and who could run the fastest, and everything became a competition. And in that kind of culture, I mean, just it's like that's where it kind of becomes for what is that is that really going to feel, if you're going to succeed kind of on the in a race or a competition, how fulfilling is that kind of in the end when you're looking back at your college years and seeing that was kind of the one thing that you were taking from it.
Right.
And that's where it's like, when do the people start to have the reflection that maybe those things matter? Because I think of injury, I guess. Like when somebody isn't able to compete in their sport, then they might look and, like you said, they don't care until they really care.
Right.
But what is it that would prompt that?
And if you have a coach, this is where I get really excited about what coaches can do to create a culture and create a team environment that looks at these bigger pictures. And a lot of coaches, I mean, there's some great coaches out there that do that see the athlete as a whole person and not just as an instrument for achievement, and cares about their long-term life and their mental health and their kind of who they are outside of the field, who they are outside of the court, and brings that directly into the team culture, that stuff matters, and has more of a tribal view of the team. And in my belief, I don't know if there's research out there, but I would say, heck yeah, that improves performance when you're creating that kind of team culture, because we are full human beings. So even if we can kind of split off part of ourselves for athletic achievement, that's not supporting a sustainable lifelong athlete.
And certainly teams. I mean, having the relationships of primary concern would make sense in terms of how you play on the court together.
Totally.
Yeah.
It seems I'm curious. I think this is the same thing you're saying, but that the coaches that I've loved in my life, shout out to Coach Nelson, and my daughter's soccer coach right now, I think is in this camp as well. They seem to understand, or they seem to think that, sport is kind of secondary. The sport itself is secondary. It's really about the lessons we're learning about life as we play this sport, and those life lessons being loss and difficulty with teammates and the relationships at hand, and the sport's kind of just a proxy to all the lessons you get to
pushing
learn
yourself
through sport. Pushing yourself, and it seems like when their focus is on the relationships, like my daughter's just coming home just feeling like super supportive of her teammates, but competitive at the same time with them.
Right.
And somehow he's created a culture like that and they think they're higher achieving because of their team culture.
Right.
Which is, I think, what you're saying. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
Totally. I mean, I think, it was something that I had the felt experience before then. I was doing it more professionally, but I mean, again, it can only go so long if you're just kind of treated as in a more objective way as an athlete for the sport performance side only, that it's just about your kind of physical training. I think you might eke something out of your athlete for a little while, but it won't last. Yeah. And I think of all the maybe some of the athletes that have then, later on gone into treatment and have kind of dealt with their mental health later. Yeah. And I think if that's a part of the coach's environment that they're creating on their team, they can do a lot of good in the world.
Yeah.
It to me asks the question of, is life about achievement?
Right. And I think that's part of the drive of these athletes is if they equate, and this was me, equating achievement with self-worth, then again, they're going to do anything to get that achievement if that's so intricately entwined. But it's entwined because of something they've gotten, some message they've gotten. That came from somewhere. That didn't just come from birth. So somehow they made that association, and that's why they're willing to do a lot of things to get there. Yeah. And that's just...
I was actually on a walk this morning, and I live by a middle school. I think it's a middle school. And I was watching all the middle schoolers walk to school. And I noticed on my first pass past the school, all these kids were kind of alone. And then suddenly when I came back about 20 minutes later, there was a collection of kids that had just started playing basketball. And I was thinking about, wow, who is the kid that got up early, decided to grab their friends or get to the court in order to make friends before class, play for 10, 15 minutes, and then go into school. It's like, who is that kid? That definitely was not me. Yeah. Definitely wasn't. But this conversation's reminding me of those kids today, because it feels like that's the kid that probably is learning, oh, if I show up, that's the time for my friends, or that's the time where I can use the skill that I have to maybe meet people or get out of my house because I hate my house, or whatever it is that has led them to this basketball court early in the morning to play before they go to school. That takes a lot of willpower to even think I was not that kid, but to think in the morning when you're that age, I want to wake up early.
Or not tough. Because they're so excited about it. Right. Yeah. Right? It goes back to that Movement is Birthright podcast about that we have different appetites. And there's some kids that would be like breathing to them.
Yeah.
It's anticipatory reward.
Oh,
they get on that
so
court.
Cool.
And it feels
I was
good.
one of those kids, and my kids are not. They would not do that. So I'm having to manage my difference between me and my girls, because our appetites are so different for that kind of thing.
Yeah.
When I've got 3 boys, and 2 of them right now are into the Xbox, folks. Video games. And it's about winning, if you're wondering.
Yeah.
It's about winning.
Yeah.
Is that about relationships
No,
with each other?
But as I'm listening, I'm like, I got to think about this because it impacts their relationships. And it's so hard for me. We actually took it away from them this weekend because it's just ridiculous how angry they get at each other because of somebody winning or losing. And I'm like, it's a video game.
Yeah. I'm thinking of all my guy friends right now who would counter that and say, no, I find so much connection because my friend that lives in Portland, we can play online on a team against some other random people online. Or I don't know exactly.
Sorry, I don't mean to go to virtual games, everybody.
But all the banter too of it, that there's so much pleasure there.
Oh my gosh, there's so much.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. A big key though is outcome. The outcome piece, right? There's so much to enjoy about competition and sport. And yet if you hang your hat on the outcome, that's when it gets, and what the outcome means, that's when it can become more problematic to either your sense of yourself or your relationships. Yeah.
I'm thinking about this though still because with a higher level athlete, I feel like that sounds maybe so much simpler than it probably feels like. Right? I mean, if your job, for instance, is sport,
right?
If that is your actual job, thinking about your relationships within it, probably not going to be your first priority each time.
Totally.
Winning, you get this much of a bump in your salary, et cetera, et cetera. It matters to win. So I think I want to go back to kind of explaining a little bit more like what are the factors that make that a healthier relationship to the sport and the movement, even when maybe winning is still the emphasis.
Right. Well, and I relate to that being a scholarship athlete, and I didn't seek help until I was off the team, and I think that was a major pressure is that of keeping my scholarship, and you have to perform. You can have your scholarship pulled from you.
Yep.
And yet I think, my answer usually just goes to, I don't know, like sort of the desire for, and maybe this would require more experimentation, I guess, potentially from coaches, but I just believe so strongly that that both can exist. It doesn't mean that if you focus on kind of the mental health aspect or sort of athletes as a whole person, that then the kind of the athletic performance is going to decline. I mean, I think it just enriches it, but that's a risk. And there's a lot of, coaches are coming from their own histories within sport or how they've been taught to coach. And I think it's scary to try something different. And I think they both can coexist. Like when I look back at my experience, I think that, my performance went through a lot of different parts of it. It got better, and then it totally dropped and got a lot worse.
Once you started becoming more concerned with
I was so disordered,
or your relationship with food was.
I was so restrictive that eventually, but the mental health side too, all the stress and anxiety that then I was having about what was going on with food, my performance declined. But I think of it, to me, it's been fun to think about the ways that these things can get more involved in sport programs. And I know people have tried to bring programming into athletic departments and the collegiate level, into adolescent programs, into youth sports, about addressing things as a whole athlete. I just learned about Z Girls, is a place that was born out of Seattle that's bringing whole athlete programming into with their athletes. And then there's Girls on the Run that brings in the programming. There's different programming that's coming in. The Body Project is the one that Carolyn Becker?
I think it's Carolyn Becker.
Yeah. Carolyn Becker has brought in, and she's tried to get that adopted in different athletic departments collegiately. So I think there's resources issues, but there's some pretty simple programming and curriculum that I think could go a long way.
Yeah. Yeah. There's something that I don't feel like we've talked about, and I bet we'll probably do another episode about this, but we kind of dropped the word nourishment, or we've talked about food a little bit within this, but I would imagine that for some it's pretty difficult to kind of separate a really healthy diet and amazing sport performance, or even like the people that are just wanting to go to the gym really regularly. It's really hard to kind of divorce that from I have to have a really strict diet as well. So I wonder if maybe Julie, you especially could speak to kind of what the actual impact is of poor nourishment and movement, or within movement, and what that actually looks like.
Yeah.
Instead of the kind of rigidity that some might imagine in terms of like super, super, super healthy, restrictive rules around stuff.
Yeah.
Because a lot of athletes do talk about really restrictive diets that they might be on. Or do they? I don't know. I think they do.
I mean, I think most athletes probably think about their nutrition to some level.
Right. They need to.
So, yeah. And so then they're going to use it. They're going to think about it in different ways depending on their personality, I think, their temperament, and also just like their own food relationship before their sport, into their sport.
Yeah.
I think kind of how food is managed within each sport's different too. But I think I do, yeah. With this being sort of temperament in sport, it's like so much like I'm like, okay, well, the OC person that would do stuff with food is going to look one way, but I think if just to say it, basically, it's like all the systems of our body need nourishment to some level, and have different interaction with the different nourishment that we put into our body. And so I think of when I think oftentimes athletes maybe come to face that, oh, nutrition might be an impact here, when maybe they have an injury or something is going on with maybe muscular or skeletal area, right? Like an injury with muscles or bones, right? A fracture or a strain or something like that. And they would maybe get some advice from who knows, like anybody, right, around them about nutrition might impact this, or maybe take this supplement or something like that. And I think sometimes maybe it gets lost that somebody's cardiovascular health can be impacted by nutrition too, right? So, okay, like, yes, our lungs and the way that we breathe is fueled by nourishment. So I think it's every system of our body, right? Digestion. So if somebody is more OC in trait, they're probably going to be more rigid. So I would probably have that as an example. I would say they probably eat more similar foods and similar routines and similar rituals. So I don't know. We could expand on that, right? But just more routine around that. And things, okay, well, I know that this works for my training days, and I know that this works for the days I'm competing. Or so I think that's something to name. And I think naturally what can happen with that is that there can be some common nutrient deficiencies that can come from that. Because if they're just eating this one thing a lot, they may be missing a whole category of food, or not integrating, variety, or not being able to have that. So I mean, there's a lot that could be impacted, but I don't know if there's anything I would add, but.
Yeah. So temperamentally, it gets emphasized that this idea that someone might be actually more susceptible than to an eating disorder, because they're thinking about these ways as their body being almost like a machine that needs kind of the right thing at the right time for this result. Yeah. And it could be more complicated
and taken to the extreme, right? Like, and the rigidity piece seems huge, which goes into the RO, is kind of the inflexibility, the rigidity and the inflexibility that can start to just do a lot of no good, do a lot of harm.
So by both like physically, like maybe leaving some of their systems in their body not working totally at their best, and then also emotionally. I think of the nervous system even, just because all of our emotions have to come through our brain and our endocrine system and all that stuff, and all that needs fat, and our brain needs fat to be able to have nice, healthy, like firing of all of those neurotransmitters. And that, okay, well, that might not be happening, right? For somebody that's not nourishing themselves with enough fat in their diet or something. So I think of that stuff too, that those things aren't always thought of maybe when they're creating what might feel good for their digestion for competition day, or like, are they thinking about maybe their emotional well-being? I don't know. Or their ability to be quick thinking on the court. Like those things, like fat could help with those things, but maybe they're not thinking about that as much as maybe which is what feels. I hear digestion as something that's oftenly like, okay, well, this feels good in my body, but maybe they can't maybe feel what's happening at the cellular level. So and all this stuff is like, I think most people that are competitive and athletic and so thoughtful about the things they're doing for their training and their nutrition are going to do so much and put so much thought into it. But it is when it gets to the extreme that then probably there's going to be a miss there that then could potentially damage their performance because of leaving one of their systems of their body not functioning well enough.
Right. And it's really common for athletes to have, you know, the rituals that they would have before a performance, before a game, before a competition. And that can be really helpful. I mean, that's something that people talk about in sports psychology. But again, it's like the question is, well, what happens if it's absent? And what happens when it's not there? Are you over relying on it? Is there a rigidity to it that I can only compete well if I've done A, B, and C? And if I have not done A, B, and C, and I perform poorly, I'm going to attribute it to those three things. And this is where I love that list of the 40 plus items that contribute to sport performance, because an OC person is going to way err on the side of I have 100% control over performance and sport outcome. And it's just bullshit. It's not true.
Right.
Like, and they're going to be, and one thing that would be hard is they're going to be less adaptive to the things that, you know, that aren't controllables. Like I usually, one of the things we'll bring into a group is just kind of take somebody through an athletic competition and have them have a result that either got their achievement or didn't. And then how are they going to process their, usually if they don't get what they want, how are they going to process that? And what are they going to assign to that? And are they going to say, well, it's because I was a little over on my weight, or I didn't eat the right thing. And are they going to kind of err on everything that would be kind of quote unquote controllable?
Right. So they could fix something.
So they can fix something versus what about the weather? What about the referee that you had no control and made two horrible calls, right? Like there's so many things within sport, especially, well, I mean, in both individual and team sports, but there's things that are uncontrollable and an OC person isn't going to want to embrace, or usually are going to give less credit to those things.
I just think of too, look, if somebody is more controlled and they want to eat the same thing every night, and let's say this like really important match or race or whatever happens just happens to be annually, it's at this place that they have a lot of friends and family. So then the night before the race, they want like people, you know, social connection could happen. And what if that could be something that could be really inspiring, but then they can't do it. They can't go out to eat because they need to eat the thing they need to eat. I just think of that of like, they're going to think that they need to eat that. But what if there could be this like fuel of like, connection that could actually move them into that. And I don't know. I just think, that
they could just
matters.
there could be some, usually a coach will say, don't try anything new the day before the race, or don't try anything. If you're going to experiment on practice days, which is good. I mean, that's sound advice.
Yeah.
Just because you don't maybe know how your body's going to respond if it's something new with food or, but like the flexibility
how can you adapt to still see the relatives or something.
Yeah. Like I remember Lauren Fleshman, whom some listeners might know of, a elite runner. She had talked about what she had done kind of pre-race meals. And then she went to a competition, I can't remember. I think it was I can't remember where it was. It was an international competition. And anyways, she was seeing people from other countries just have such different type of pre-race meal. Yeah, the Africans had such a different meal. And so it allowed her to take that step and that jump to try something different in a pre-race meal, because she was kind of, open and flexible that maybe what she thought was the perfect thing to be eating before a competition could possibly be other options and alternatives.
Oh, interesting.
And this is, if I might offer the definition of psychological health from RODBT, which you're getting at with Lauren's story. And so those three prongs, and maybe this is how we can think about when the OC starts to get a person in trouble. Because the first pillar is receptivity and openness. So in that story, you're saying that Lauren saw these people trying a different meal before she was open to that new information about food.
Right. Totally.
She was able to take that in. Also receptivity and openness to coaches. Are they giving you feedback? Are you open to what they're saying or the environment? Or are you receptive and open to your times and how you're performing and all of that? And then the second prong is flexible responding. So that's your behavioral adaptation. So now that you have this information, now that you have this new way of thinking, do you make changes to your behavior based on that new information? And maybe if you're in trouble, if your OC is causing you trouble, you might be more in a rigid posture and just not changing your behavior based on the new information that you may or may not be receiving. And then the third prong is connectedness, relationships, and closeness. So
yeah, it's a great example of that.
Right. And I think about coachability in that in
Mhm.
those prongs.
Totally.
In the first and second one, how coachability is all about receptivity and openness and flexibly responding.
Mhm.
And the one that seems to be one that is more controversial maybe is the connectedness one and how that relates to performance.
Yeah. And yet I'm imagining people that have like accepted awards and won, and they're sharing the story of I did this for my mother, or I am so grateful for this, or I was thinking about this person as this big motivating factor for my coach, right?
Totally.
Yeah, gratitude to the coach.
Yeah. So it can be in there.
One of the-
Even though I
And
was
how to
playing
have a
devil's
complex
advocate.
relationship.
Totally.
I mean,
Right.
the athlete-coach relationship's really complex.
Yeah.
So
One of the things I wanted to add to the flexible responding is, and this is just from what I know, if I zoom back into my 20-year-old self, is how scary it is to make a change as an athlete. It is really hard. So I think for athletes out there that are listening, I want to say kind of be brave, but also you can do it in the off season, like trying it out when the stakes aren't so high, because it is really scary. I mean, it was so scary to do anything different because the lot felt on the line. I mean, now in retrospect, it's a whole different, I can see it so differently, but in the moment, man, a lot felt on the line. So I guess just wanting to say it's really hard. And I would encourage you to take small steps in kind of in a time that the stakes aren't so high. If you feel open to maybe challenging some of the unhelpful OC behaviors. Oh, and the other thing I was thinking about what Lexi just said about coaches and coachability is this idea that an OC person can almost go so far into just listening and responding to what the coach has to say that they're kind of disavowing themselves and not trusting their own body's cues, right? That they're not having their body's response be a part of what they are bringing into what they need as an athlete. That actually could be really valuable information and really enhance performance. And so that would be just another thing to consider in this is, can you turn to your body for decision making and have your body actually give you some good information that could be part of that flexible control and the receptivity and openness. Because this whole no pain, no gain, I just have to be a soldier and do what my coach says. I mean, I know at least in my experience with athletics, that didn't serve me well. There was a part of listening to what the coach had to say, and yet there was also really important information that my body was saying as an individual athlete.
And in RODBT, we would hold the dialectic of wisdom and self-doubt, which I think you're getting at, Kara, where the wisdom might be how your body is experiencing the sport, and the self-doubt might be letting in coach's voice and holding both of those as important sources of information and not neglecting one or the other.
Yeah, I love that. That actually brings me to kind of this new idea that we had for ending today. One of our listeners actually requested that we kind of pose some takeaway questions that people can be pondering on their own. So we wanted to offer those to everybody just as things to reflect upon, or maybe some prompting questions. Kara, can you read this for us?
Great. Yeah. So first question is, what is your motivation behind sport achievement? And what are the sacrifices you're making to achieve your goals? And is the effort in alignment with your values? Do you still have joy in your sport? And what are you afraid might happen if you break a training rule or an exercise rule? And to what I was saying earlier, what rule might you consider changing to see what happens? And if you take that risk, what support do you need to do this?
Awesome. I love those. If you yourself as a listener have further questions, or in general when you're listening to The Appetite, if you have something that you're really wanting us to discuss or a question you want us to answer, you can now email us at theappetite@opalfoodandbody.com. We are really excited about getting some questions from you all and hopefully incorporating them into an upcoming episode.
Winfield Vikings.
What?
Winfield Vikings, yeah.
Wisco Vikings.
What? You were a Viking
I was a
too?
Viking too, yes. Wisconsin Lutheran.
Ooh. I was Scots. Go Scots.
Scots. What is a Scot?
Scotsman?
Scottish person.
Oh.
They played the bagpipes.
That's really scary.
Kilts.
That's
Wore
really
kilts.
really scary, Kara.
I don't think I ever was attached to that.
I went to a school that was the Barons, which is like the leprechauns or something.
Oh,
I think
that's also not scary.
I don't know. It's scary, right? Thank you so much for listening. And thanks to Jack Straw Cultural Center for sound engineering, to Aaron Davidson for The Appetite's music, to Opal's Sarah Taylor for production assistance and editing. You can find more episodes of The Appetite on iTunes. You can subscribe in order to find new episodes every other week. If you ever have questions for us, as I mentioned earlier, you can email us at theappetite@opalfoodandbody.com. If you're interested in learning more about Opal, find us at opalfoodandbody.com or on Facebook or Twitter.